Bava Batra is payback. Please let me know if I have any connection issues. So raise your hand or stop me. But we are up to the two dots. So the Mishnah yesterday, very important Mishnah for today's daf, important like all Mishnayot, said that if you purchase a tree, right, and you don't specify whether you want the area around the tree. So Ken mentioned the issue yesterday that we discussed before, and we're going to discuss again today, which is how do you get to the tree, right? If the tree is in the middle of somebody else's field, do you have to, fly into the field to get to your tree? Do you get a path into the field? That was machloket of mocher ba'ayin yafeh, mocher ba'ayin ra'ah. And we're going to get into that machloket about how it impacts our Mishnah. But more specifically, our Mishnah discussed, when you buy a tree, do you buy the tree that's there, or do you buy the tree and the space around it that nourishes that tree? And the difference between those two, says the Mishnah, is that if you buy a tree and you just buy the tree and not the land around it, and the tree dies, you're out of luck. You can't replant the tree. You don't own that space. But if you bought the tree and the land around it, then you get to rebuild it. Furthermore, let's say there are, and that's what we're about to quote here, let's say the tree itself grows tall and starts spreading out and there's shade on somebody else's property. And the other person comes to you and says, cut down your tree. So if you own the land under the tree, then he could say, you only own a certain amount of land. You can't let your tree grow wherever it wants. But if you never bought land at all, then you don't have to worry about it because you don't have anything to do with the land. Your whole tree is going on top of somebody else's land. The fact that it got bigger is not your problem. So in some ways, that would be, not in some ways, that would be a kula of not owning the land. The final thing, which again, we're about to discuss, is that we said, what about things that grow, right? There's very often shoots that come out from the bottom of the tree, from the trunk, or from the roots. And so we said that if you own the tree and a shoot comes out from the trunk, you get to keep it, of course. But if it comes out from the roots, meaning from the ground below the tree, then you don't, right? So says the Mishnah, that was the Mishnah said, if it grows from the geza, which means the trunk, you can keep it because it's part of the tree. If it grows from the sharashim, if another tree grows out from the roots, you can't keep it because you don't own the land and you don't own the roots. Says the Mishnah now, says the Gemara, sorry, two dots. That's our intro. Hikdilu lo yishata. The Mishnah said if it grew, you shouldn't cut it down. But then it continued. That's not the part actually we're discussing. The Mishnah continued and said, if it grew from the geza, you get to keep it. If it grew from the sharashim, you don't get to keep it. So ask the Gemara, hechidami min hageza, hechidami min sharashim. What's considered the trunk and what's considered the roots? Like where does the tree end and the roots begin? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, it depends on what's visible. Kol shiro'eh pnei chama, anything that is visible, meaning it sees the sun, right? So even sometimes you have roots, of course, that are above ground, that is considered zehu min hageza. That's considered to be the trunk and the central part of the tree, and you keep it. She'ena ro'eh pnei chama, something that doesn't see the sun, meaning the actual source that it's coming from is underground, zeo min hasharashim. That's considered to be the roots, and you don't get to keep it. Ask the Gemara, but why don't you worry that maybe it was exposed, but it got covered, right? Meaning leichash, why don't you worry? Dilma maska ara sirtin, that the earth sort of filled it up with sirton, which is like sediment or other, dirt and things like that. Meaning that basically when you bought the tree, right, then you sort of had this area, you thought it was exposed essentially, the ground actually covered it. And now something is growing out of the area that is covered, right? So actually it's not the question is the following. I take it back. We're doing the other side first. The question here is, let's say you might have a situation. Remember, the whole mission was talking about where you bought one tree according to every mayor, or two trees according to Chachamim. If you buy 3 trees, everybody agrees that you bought a cluster of trees and you get all the land in between them and sort of outside of them, and we'll discuss that too. Ask the Gemara, why aren't you worried that Dilma Maska Ara Sirton, that you'll have basically one tree that has 2 different sort of sources of the tree, which you often have. The ground will basically fill up with sediment in between those sources, and you'll look like 2 trees, right? The Amarle, and the person will say to you, oh, I have 3 trees, Lata Zabintale, Mitliara, right? So meaning if you're basically just talking about what's visible and what's not visible, that will change over time. And that's the fundamental question. Ella Amr of Nachman, says of Nachman, you're right.
When you're talking
right?
about one tree, how can a tree look like 2 trees?
Right, because let's say you have many trees like this, that very close to the source of the ground, it grows in 2 separate sort of, tall things, or even one is tall and one is very short, right? You have a very
You're
small
talking
sapling.
about one tree. right?
You're talking about one tree. The question is how you define one tree, right? Because we said that if things grow from the roots of the tree, they're considered to be a separate tree, right? So the question we asked is how do you know what the roots are and how do you know what this trunk is? And we said it's whether it's visible. Ask the Gemara, but so what if it's visible, right? Um, if visible or invisible. Things can be visible and then become invisible by being filled in. Ella Amar of Nachman says of Nachman, the reality is that that the if something grows out of the trunk of the tree, then yikuts. You've got to cut it down. You've got to cut it down. And why is that? Because Amar of Nachman, or this is related, but says of Nachman, Nikatina, we have a tradition that dekel ein lo geza, that a dekel, a palm tree, does not have, now it doesn't mean it doesn't have a trunk. It means it doesn't have growth that comes out of its trunk, right? So a dekel grows tall, as everybody knows. It has lots and lots of growth at the top. It doesn't have growth. Like some trees have growth that comes out of the base of the tree or the trunk of the tree. But a decal doesn't have that, right? So
How's he
therefore,
saying? But we were saying that this is one tree. So how can whoever it is says Amarle Talata Zabeni Li? How do you can say you sold me three
it's
trees if you sold him
again
only one?
because if you have two trees that are one tree, let's say one tree, and a second tree that grows up from the roots of that tree, that's considered to be a second tree, according to what we said initially, if you can't see the connection between the two of them, right? So the challenge that we asked was, if that's true, which we're now coming back from, if that's true, then how could it be that you can say it's a second tree? It's possible that it was connected, it was visible, and over time, over 10 years of sediment and erosion, the things you have dirt that's came up between them, and it looks like two trees. So basically, it's not really three trees, but the person can claim it's three trees because all what we were saying initially, which again we've come back from now, is that it depends on whether you can see the connection between them, whether it's ro'eh pnei chama, right?
So
So
there was one
yeah, there was.
tree.
Forget about the
eh,
third tree. There's a third. There's two trees.
Okay.
One of the two trees becomes a third. Right? That's a simple. So says Rav Nachman. But we have a klal that by a dekel ein luges, a palm tree never never has growth that, well, we'll see what he thinks means in a second, but that a palm tree does not have growth that comes out of the trunk of the tree. And therefore, what that means is that if you see a second sort of shoot coming out, well, Savar Rav Zvid, let me read the Gemara. Rav Zvid thought to say that what that means is ein lo geza the Baal Hadeka, meaning that the things that grow out of the trunk of the tree are not owned by the owner of the tree, right? And the reason for that is because kivan to the michbar u'l'sharesh koi, right? Because since generally people, when you have a second, let's say you have a palm tree, and you have a second palm tree sort of coming up, a very baby palm tree coming up from the base of that tree. What people normally do is they understand that it's not likely to be attached to the tree. It's likely that under the ground, it's its own thing. And so you dig down, michpar, which means you dig down, ulisharesh, right? And you root it, or you uproot it, and you move it somewhere else. And so, since it's likely that that's the case, asuchi masech daite, the person who buys the tree assumes that I'm not going to get ownership of the small trees that grow up near the trunk of the tree, right? So it's really just hesed hadat. That's what Rav Zvid thought. The matkafa Rav Papa said, one second, I don't understand why you could say that. What about if you just buy, right? And this is the case of our Mishnah. Kona shnei ilanot. A person buys two trees in a field, right? Now you have to understand that if I'm buying two trees in a field, there's a very good chance that I'm buying them in order to pick them up and move them to my field. Because even if you get rights to go to someone else's field, it's very cumbersome to go to their field and take their stuff. So obviously, in that case, whenever you buy isolated trees in somebody else's field, we can assume that you have some thought and intention to go uproot those trees and take them somewhere else, right? However, even if that's the case, um, then Katani Yesh Legeza. We still say that in that case, you get to keep the things that grow from the trunk. And you just said that in a dekel, people don't have that in mind. El Amar of Papa says of Papa, what really the explanation of Rav Nachman is, Ein Lo Geza the Baal dekel. The reason, what he's saying is what I said initially, is that if you see something growing from the roots of that tree, it doesn't belong to the owner of the tree. Lefi she'ein motzi geza. It's because the nature of a palm tree, when you say the nature, right, it could be the nature in the context of the vast, vast majority of palm trees don't grow a second tree or additional growth from the base of the tree. If something is growing there, it's almost always independent growth. And therefore, because it's a specific halacha about a palm tree, not a specific halacha about trees. Ask the Gemara, Rav Zvid, but according to Rav Zvid, who says that, in fact, Rav Nachman's going according to all trees, including palm trees, kashia matznitin. How do you understand our Mishnah when our Mishnah seems to say that you can uproot the tree and still you get to keep the geza? Answers Rav Zvid, our Mishnah would be talking about dizabin lechameshnin. You'd have to understand our Mishnah where a person said to somebody else, look, I want to buy a tree, not the case that we initially explained. I don't want to buy a tree. I want to buy the rights to your tree for 5 years. It's a lease, basically. And what that means, if you buy the rights, let's say if I buy a car for 5 years, well, car's a bad example. Let's say I buy a tree for 5 years. If that tree dies, I actually get to replace it. So we were thinking this whole time that you don't get to replace it, right? In a case where you buy a tree, the tree dies or falls down or whatever, it gets uprooted, you can't use that ground. But in this case, you actually didn't say, I'm just buying the tree. You said, I'm buying this growth for 5 years, which means that if the tree falls down after 1 year, you are allowed to get more trees. And in that, you can plant up to 5 years, not forever. And therefore, you're allowed to keep the things that grow out of the trunk, even though it's new growth. Continue the Mishnah.
But what does it have to, what, the two separate things here? What is, if the tree falls down or it's destroyed, or, and he said, I'll replant that tree, and we had that discussion before, yes or no. How does that relate to something growing out of the tree, no matter from where it grows, the trunk, the geza?
Right, because basically something growing out of the trunk, out of the geza of a palm tree is considered to be a new tree. And so the question of our Mishnah was that you're not really allowed to keep new growth, right? Unless it's integral to the tree, unless it's growing from the trunk. What Razvid is now saying is that the case in our Mishnah is actually different. The case in our Mishnah is where you bought the rights to everything that grows here for 5 years, as long as it's connected. And therefore, even if it grows from the ground, and essentially it's a new tree, but it's growing from the roots of the old tree, you get to keep that for 5 years, not forever. You get to keep it for 5 years.
So is it maybe he's buying the land and not just the tree?
That's could be the case, but that's not until you get to 3. But that's the next case. You got to the next words exactly of the Mishnah, which is.
But we said earlier that it looks like 3, that you see saying because there were 3 other trees there.
No,
you showed 3 trees.
Right, but this case we're not no 3. We're just talking about where you bought the tree, but you bought it for a specific amount of time, and therefore you get
I
everything.
understand that here, but earlier we talked. I still don't understand how he said to him, "You sold me 3 trees, and therefore then I can own the ground." In the beginning of the discussion.
So there are 3 trees, right? You might have bought 2, and the third one might have grown from one of the second ones. The question is, how do you define 3 trees and how do you define 2 trees? So in the beginning, we said it's based on whether you can see the roots, see the growth separated. And the Gemara had a problem with that because land moves over time.
Oh, so maybe he actually bought 3, or maybe
maybe
bought 3
2
because they're okay, but he thought that
maybe it was 50 years ago. It wasn't anyone recent.
Yeah, I understand, but maybe he says he thought, well, this one came up, and you really sold me 3 trees, and
Correct.
so therefore I get to keep all this. And this new growth is part of what you sold me.
Correct. Something like that. Continues the Gemara. Kana shlosha. Let's get to what we're all talking about now. Let's say you bought 3 trees. So the Mishnah said everybody agrees that kana karka, you get the land around the trees. How much land do you get? Right? The kama. So it says from Chiyah Bar Abba, Rabbi Yochanan, last line of Daf Pei Bet Amid Aleph, Hareza kana tachtehem, you acquired the land right beneath them, and beinehem, and the land between them. Remember, you have 3 trees. So the space, let's say you have 3 trees in a triangle, you get all the space in between them, right? Because they have to be connected, these 3 trees. The chutzalem, and you get space outside of the trees, which is kimilo, turn the page, kimilo ore pisalo. Enough space. We've had this measure before. Sorry, let me just turn my daf.
He needs to be able to work the land, right? Then we talked about Avodat Kerem or Avodat, whatever it is.
Well, yeah, but this is not quite Avodat Kerem. This is the space. Ore visalo. Ore means the person who actually gathers the figs, the worker, the fig gatherer, right? And his basket, right? Which is probably not a small basket, probably some kind of industrial basket.
No, so I was just saying Karen because it's it's sort of an example. He has to free to work around the land.
Correct. They're different shurim depending on what the thing is. But obviously for what we're talking about now, which we assume is figs, you get the area around it. You get the area between them, and you get the area around it so that you can walk on the outside of the tree and gather your produce. Now we get to what you want to talk about yesterday, Ken.
How does he
Ask
get
Rebbe,
there?
ask Rebbe Lazar, I don't understand. Ashta derech einlo. Right now, Rebbe Lazar makes a huge assumption. Remember, we had a machloket tanaim before, be Akiva and the Chachamim. Well, if I buy a tree in the middle of someone else's land, do I get a path to that tree, or do I have to buy that separately or negotiate that? So Rebbe Lazar assumes, we'll see why in a second, that the halacha is like the Chachamim, that mocher ba'ayin ra'ah mocher. That if you sell, you limit what you sell. And if I sell you a tree in the middle of my field, I didn't tell you how to get there. You got to buy an access route or get lucky, right? So asked Rebbe Elazar, Matkifla Rebbe Elazar, I don't get it. We pass like the Chachamim, and Hashta derech einlo, right? You don't even give him a path to walk to his tree, but you're going to give him a path around the tree to carry his orev v'salo yeshlo, right? It doesn't make any sense that you're giving him extra space when in fact you don't even give him a small amount to walk there. Now the Gersa here is a little tough. I want to read just what the Bach does because he cuts out a few words, which makes it a little simpler. I gotta find the Bach in this Gemara. The Bach actually just makes it all sort of one question because in our Gemara really it's like a double question, which is the same thing. The derech ein lo salo or v'sal yeshlo derech ein lo da'arach v'tihu or v'sal yeshlo. So he just cuts out sort of one of the clauses. But basically what he reads is that derech ein lo da'arach v'tihu, right? You don't have a path because it's somebody else's land. All you bought is the tree. So Yorah Vasali Yeshlo. So therefore, how could it be that you would get sort of even more space to have space outside the trees, right, for a worker and a gatherer? It's one thing to say that you get all the space in between the trees, right? Because you bought 3 trees, that's a mini orchard, and you get that space. But we don't even give you a path to walk there. Why would we give you a path around the outside? Amar Rebbe Zera. Says Rebbe Zera, you want to know something? Midivrei Rabbeinu Nomad, from the fact that we asked this question, Rebbe Elazar asked this question, I understand that it's only Shlosha hu de'en lo derech. Fascinating. When the Chachamim say that if you buy a tree, you don't get a path, that's only if you buy 3 trees, because you bought basically a mini cluster, a mini orchard. And so you bought that, it's your own thing, you don't get access to it. Hashnayim yeshlo, right? If you buy only 2 trees, you actually are automatically, even according to the Chachamim, allowed to walk in the land to get to your trees. Why? The Amar Le, because you can say to the owner, you basically are giving me permission. I bought trees and I didn't buy the land under the trees. So how is that possible? You're clearly giving me permission to be on your land, right? My tree is on your land. So if my tree is on your land, I can be on your land. And basically, you're essentially giving me an easement, free right, to walk towards your tree, to my tree, sorry. That's true if there's 2 trees, because I don't own any land. However, if there are 3 trees, then I buy the land in between them, and then it's a machloket. Do I get space around it or not get space, not space around, space to it or not space to it? And the question of Rebbe Elazar is how in the world does it make sense to say that you give him a space around the tree if you don't even give him a way to walk to the tree? Okay.
How do you define the path for the 2 trees? How do you define the path that the owner of the trees is allowed to walk? Can he walk
I don't
anywhere
know.
on the owner's
Yeah,
land, or do he has to work a circuitous route, or does he only be
it's a,
between a certain space he's allowed, only a specific path? Yeah, otherwise he could
yeah,
destroy
no,
the owner's land because walking every day in a different path.
that's a good question. I don't know the exact answer, but presumably I don't know the exact answer. But let's continue. So says Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak the Rava. Amalei Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak the Rava. Where are we? Around 6 lines down. Said Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak the Rava. This seems to be a really bizarre question that Rebbe Lazar asked. Right? Rebbe Lazar's question was: we pass like the Chachamim that mocher ba'ayin ra'ah mocher, and therefore you don't even get a path to your trees. So how does it make sense? You get a path around your trees. Says the Gemara, but I don't understand how Rebbe Lazar would make that assumption. Lema Rebbe Lazar, let's Shmuel Rabbe. Does Rebbe Lazar not hold like his teacher? Rebbe Lazar, remember, was a Amora who was a student of Shmuel. He doesn't hold like Shmuel his teacher, Damar Shmuel, because Shmuel is quoted as saying, Halacha Rabbi Akiva, the Amar Mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher. Rabbi Akiva clearly paskins you Mocher ba'ayin yafa. So how could Rebbe Lazar come up with this huge assumption and say, well, we know that you don't sell a path, so how could it be that you get space outside the trees? if we pass like Rabbi Akiva, if his teacher Shmuel passed like Rabbi Akiva, right? That you in fact do get a path. Amrali said to him, "You're right. It's very possible Rabbi Lazar agrees with his teacher Shmuel that passes like Rabbi Akiva. But the point is that our Mishnah can't be going like Rabbi Akiva, right? So lo mitukma matnitin Rabbi Akiva. It's impossible to understand that our Mishnah is going like Rabbi Akiva that mocher ba'ayin yafa. And therefore, even though he might personally pass like his Rebbe, that the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, in explaining our Mishnah must be going like the Chachamim. Mimai. Now, how do I know that? Tani, because the Mishnah continues and says, Higdilu, right? If your tree grows very tall and the branches spread out and they go over somebody else's field, or I guess your trees are in the middle of somebody else's field, so by definition, they go and spread out, yishapeh, right? If there's one or two trees, if there's more than three trees, you have to cut them down and prune them. Now, Rabbi Akiva, if our Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva, then Amai Shapeh. Why do you have to prune your trees? Why don't you say, Ho'amar, mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher? Why don't you assume that if you sell a tree, a sell of space, you're selling it with ayin yafa, you're selling it with all the future rights that come along with it, and that's including the thought possibility that my tree is going to grow and it's going to spread, and I'm not going to make you cut it down. Why don't you assume that the owner allows him to have it there? It seems like we're assuming our Mishnah is mocher ba'ayin ra'ah. Now, Amalei said back to him, that's not a very good proof at all. Because remember, the whole machloket of Rabbi Akiva, Amar to Amar Rabbi Akiva, remember, Rabbi Akiva was talking about a case where you had a bar bedut, where you built like a ditch or a cistern, right? And those are things where Rabbi Akiva said, you sell ba'ayin yafeh, and you allow the person to walk there and you allow the person to get there, lo mikach shi'ara. Because by being generous in those cases, you don't weaken your land. But here, Gabi Elon Mishamadli, here by a tree, right? If I allow you to have your tree grow uncontrolled and it causes shade over all my wheat fields, right? Obviously, I'm losing. So there was a case basically where I won't necessarily lose, right? It was almost no gain and no lose, no loss, basically. So I'm mocher ba'ayin yafa. But here, this actually would cause damage to Rabbi Akiva, to the owner of the field, according to Rabbi Akiva. So he wouldn't agree. Min lo modi Rabbi Akiva. Doesn't Rabbi Akiva admit that if you have an ilan hanutel istuch stei chavero, remember the classic halacha we had many times before, which is that if you have a tree that that leans over into the field of your friend, shekotzeitz, right, that you can cut down the amount of that tree in your field, milo mardea mial gabe machrisha, high enough for the mardea. Remember, the mardea was like the plow, right? The margin actually is the stick that you use to hit the oxen above the plow. So basically, let's say your tractor is 10 feet tall, right? You have to drive your tractor around your road. And if his tree is leaning out into your field and you can't do it, everyone agrees, it seems, that you can cut it down. So even Rabbi Akiva, who says that when you sell ba'ayin yafet, does not mean that you accept that a person can walk all over you, right? And therefore, it doesn't really make any sense, right? Because it's very conceivable that our Mishnah could be going like Rabbi Akiva. And if our Mishnah is going like Rabbi Akiva, it doesn't really understand why Rabbi Lazar is assuming that we pass like the Chachamim to ask this question. It must be, why doesn't speak this out? It must be that for some reason Rabbi Lazar does not agree with his Rabbi Shmuel, and that Rabbi Lazar assumes that mocher ba'ayin ra'ah mocher, like the Chachamim, and therefore he asked the question in our Mishnah.
So we
Now,
learned earlier in several cases a few weeks ago that if someone's tree or his property is extending even into the Reshut Rabim, he's obligated to cut to
right.
remove that space. And in fact, there's something in the Gemara said he can move his boundary back a few feet so that his tree or his roof or whatever doesn't extend into the neighbor's property or Reshut Rabim. He has to cut it down or move it,
Right.
remove it.
Correct. So that's what we just said, that even according to Rabbi Akiva, who says mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher, it doesn't include cases like that, where you're actually causing damage to somebody else. It says the Gemara, Tanya Kavati Rabbi Chiya Abba. In fact, there's a brighter that says what Rabbi Chiya Abba said a few minutes ago, which is how much do you get around the trees? Hareze kana tachtehem ubeinehem. You're going to the space beneath the trees and in between, again, if you have three trees, three almost always makes a triangle, I guess, unless they're in a straight line. But I guess they have to be a triangle here. You're going to the space in between them. The chutza lahem kimalo orev salo, and like Rabbi Chiya Bar Abba said, the Braita says the same thing. You're going outside of the trees, the space enough for the worker to walk and for him to have his basket. Now, Amar Le Abaye and Rav Yosef asked Abaye to Rav Yosef a very fascinating question. That space, right? So remember, you're basically dedicated to this. Let's say it's 2 feet or 4 feet. I'll say 4 feet just to be generous, right? Outside of the circumference of these trees. Okay. During harvesting season, maybe planting season, you have to let someone walk there. But the rest of the year, you can plant crops there, right? There's no reason why you can't plant a quick crop or a tomato or whatever in that space. So ask the Abai to Rav Yosef who owns that space, right? I bought trees. I get a right to get the space outside of them. But do I own that space or do I just have a right to use it, right? And the owner of the field really owns the space. So I'm going to buy the Rav Yosef. Otan oret v'salo. That space that is dedicated to the worker and the basket, mizoran. Who gets to plant that space? Amalei tinito. We have a Mishnah. There's a Mishnah which we're going to have later on, which is hachitzon zoyat derech. This is the case later when we talk about. Remember, we had a whole case where basically a person buys a garden. We've quoted this many times, but the Mishnah is later. A person, right? There's a garden, an inner garden inside an outer garden. Right. This was the case of Mocher B'Ayin Yafeh, etc. And a person buys the inner garden. So that we said in some cases that the owner of the outer garden has to give him a path to get to his garden. However, the Mishnah says later, that the path, although the inner guy gets a right to the path, he doesn't own the path, and therefore the outer person gets to plant the path. And therefore, here too, by the fig trees, right, the outside person gets to plant in the space that's outside the trees. Amar Le, so he said to him, "One midami, I don't get it. That's not really a comparable case from that Mishnah. Hatam let leip the right there. There's nothing. The one who purchased the inner field has a right to a path from the outer field, the outer garden. And if you say that the outer person gets to plant that path, the inner person loses nothing. He has no space lost from his garden. So that's why it makes sense to say that halacha. Avahacha, but here, if you allow the outside person to plant in the area surrounding the fig trees, it there might be some loss to the lokeach, the person who bought it. Because he can say, "Kamitanfi peri, my fruits are going to get dirty." Right? What does that mean? Now, look, it's very natural for figs to fall off the tree. And when they fall into regular ground or sandy ground, they just sit there. But if you start planting things on the ground and you have tomatoes and cucumbers or whatever, then when my fruits fall onto that ground, they might get ruined, right? They'll get dirty, nothing but ruined. So therefore, I might lose something. In that case, haladami al l'seifa. This, in fact, is more similar to the second case of the Mishnah later on. The second case of the Mishnah later on is,
why don't we say that the mocher could also lose, because if the lokeach buys the fig trees or the tree and he walks to these trees, he will damage the tomatoes and the cucumbers that the mocher planted there. That's a loss of a peseda to the mocher.
I mean, I don't. Yeah, I mean, there is some loss because obviously you can't plant. You have to be careful, but there is some loss. But that's part of buying the tree, right? If you sell a tree and you sell it as an orchard, as 3 trees, you're basically selling some space outside of them. That's what you're accepting. But says our Gemara, Haladami al l'seifa. This is similar to the end of that. Again, this is all referring to this Mishnah later on in Tzaditet. This refers to the second part of the Mishnah because the Mishnah later on has a new case. Let's say that the owner of the outside garden does not want to give up a path to the inside garden, right? And so he says, you can't walk straight through my field. You can walk around the side. I'll give you space on the side, right? And if I give him space on the side, what happens then is that instead of walking a straight shot from the entranceway to his garden, he's got to make a circuitous route, which gets to your question before, Ken. There, the Mishnah says that since basically you're making him work harder by walking around, you're also taking space away from the outside person. Zev v'zeh, now we're quoting the Mishnah, einan risha'in l'zorah. In such a case, neither one of them is allowed to plant that field because since each one basically is giving up something by dedicating this open space, neither one of them can really claim to be the primary owner. And in fact, says the Braita, says Abaya, Tani Kavati Dabaya, there's a Braita that supports Abaya, which says, in our case, in our Mishnah of the figs, right? The person who bought 3 fig trees acquires the trees, the land under them, the land between them, meaning in between them, v'chutza lahem, and the land outside of them, kimelo oreh b'salo, the space of his worker and his basket, v'zeh inan rishayim zara, but neither the owner of the outside field nor the owner of the inside tree orchard are allowed to plant in that space, because since each one of them basically gave up something for this, we can't assume that either one is allowed to get the benefit from it.
But if we still decided whether it's ayin yafa or ayin roka'ah,
I mean, we
does
still
he
have a
have to pay?
machloket.
Does he have to pay for that to access to the
So
to
that's
his three trees?
it's still a machloket, right?
Oh,
According to the Chachamim, presumably you still would have to pay access or get a helicopter. Yeah. So that's where we are. Where are we up to now? Sorry.
the kama yehi beinehem.
Thank you. Right. So this gets to our next question. I'm just trying to find. Sorry, I have an online Gemara. Kama yehi beinehem. It's the fifth to last narrow line. So this gets to the next final question of today, which is, right, we send our mission, if you buy 3 trees, that becomes an orchard. But what does that mean, 3 trees? It's going to be 3 trees that are, 20 feet apart, 3 trees that are next to each other. Like how, what does that mean, right? Kama yehe benehem, what is the space between the trees in order for them to constitute a unit, right? Now, remember, you can buy trees, we've had this before, they have tree farms, right? Where you can buy 50 trees in 10 feet that are not going to be able to stay there. You know you're going to uproot them and move them away. So clearly that's not going to be an orchard. You're definitely moving the trees. So what does it mean? How much space do you have to have here? So Rav Yosef said in the name of Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, remember the names here, they're very important. Rav Yosef in the name of Rav Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel, said, Me'arba amot vat shmona. 4 to 8 amot is the magic spot, meaning if they're closer than 4 amot together, that's not sustainable. You're going to uproot the tree, and it doesn't even count like 2 trees, right? But if it's between 4 and 8, that's considered to be a nice space between trees. If it's more than 8, already it's considered to be a separate space. And so if they're more than 8 amot apart, they don't combine, and it won't be considered 3 trees together. So
And
that's
they're
what Rav
less than
Yosef said.
4? If they're
Less than
less
4, it won't either, because less than 4, you know that it's not going to be sustainable. You're going to uproot the tree, right? So clearly you have to move one of them. And so it really only counts basically like one of the trees. So it can't be closer than 4 and it can't be more than 8. Rava says, Rav Nachman or Shmuel, which remember different people, but Shmuel's at the end of the party, right? Rava says in the name of Rav Nachman, in the name of Shmuel, Mishmona ad sheish esrei. Actually, it's more than that. Even 8 amot is too, if 4 amot is too close, it has to be between 8 amot and 16 amot. Okay, so if it's less than 8 amot, then they don't count. You can't compare them, and you can't combine them as sort of a group. And if it's more than 16 amot, that's already considered to be much too far. So that was the machlok about what it is for trees. Now, said Abaye to Rav Yosef, Abaye, remember, is not part of this yet. Abaye showed up and said to Rav Yosef, I don't think you should argue on Rav Nachman. Remember, Rav Nachman didn't say anything. Rava quoted Rav Nachman in the name of Shmuel. But basically, Abaye came to defend Rava and said to Rav Yosef, don't tiflig aled Rav Nachman. I wouldn't recommend arguing with Rav Nachman. It's not matnitin kavate, because there's a Mishnah that supports this measurement of Rav Nachman, that 16 amot is considered to be the maximum, and we'll see about the 8 in a second. But what's the Mishnah? And now we quote a Mishnah, a very complicated Mishnah in Masechet Bikurim. In Klein, sorry, not Bikurim, that was yesterday. It's not. As the Mishnah says in Masechet Kilayim, we are in the first wide line, right? Hanotea et karmo, right? Remember, if you plant a vineyard, you're not allowed to plant wheat or other crops inside your vineyard. Okay, it's not. There's a lot of different halachot of Klein. One halachah of Klein is actually planting 2 things together. But there's another halacha that if you already have a keren, you have a space that's called a vineyard, you can't plant other things inside of that space, right? However, says the Mishnah in Kilayim, if you plant at Noteat Karmo, if you plant your vineyard and it's sheish esrei amma al sheish esrei amma, there is 16 amot between each row of vines, right? You have a long row of vines, might be 10,000 feet long, I don't know. And in between one row and the next row, you have 16 amot. Says the Mishnah, that's not a vineyard, because that's considered to be a row of vines next to another row of vines, right? But because they're 16 or more amot apart, they are totally distinct things. And therefore, as a consequence, you can plant whatever you want in between them. right? Because as long as what you're planting does not actually grow in the roots of those things, which would be a separate issue, but it's not considered to be a vineyard because they're 16 amot separated. Mutter lahavi zera l'sham. You can bring seeds and plant them
Yeah,
in the middle of that space.
isn't his vineyard 16 by 16? That's his vineyard.
No, it means 16 between each row.
But it says
Right,
we think of a square of 16,
right. So it's
16
not
cubic 16 cubic square feet, for
right.
instance.
It just means that in each direction, meaning if you have some going sideways, they also have 16 amot. But basically, between each row of vines, you have 16 amot till the next row. And as a consequence, the Mishnah says you're basically allowed to plant whatever you want in between. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, and this is a continuation of the Mishnah in Kilayim. Maasebet Salmon. In fact, there was a story in Salmon, which is a place I don't exactly know where. Be'achad shenata et karmo sheshes ama. He planted his karam 16 amot apart. So 16 amot is very far, by the way, right? It's like 30, 25 to 30 feet. So he planted each row of vines 16 amot away from the next one. Okay. And what he would do, this person, very interestingly, is hayahofech sa'ar shtei shurot mitzad echad. What he would do is he would turn the sa'ar, which sa'ar is the terminology we have for the hair of the vines, right? So the vines, as everybody knows, the roots might be central, but the vines can spread out very, very far. They can go many feet out from there. And what
So
he
the
would do is
branches, the
the
branches.
branches. Correct, correct. He would basically take, let's say you had row 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, let's just say. He would take, and in between them space A, B, C, and D, right? He would take row 1 and row 2 and push the branches towards each other. So basically, most understand that this is just because of shade, just because of and so basically that all the shade would come onto one space A, and then he would take row 3 and 4 and push them towards each other. And then space B in between row 2 and 3 would be completely exposed to the sun, and you could plant beautiful tomatoes there, right? So basically, he would be hofech sa'ar. Sa'ar is the word we're using for the branches, as you said, but the hair basically of the vine. Shtei shurot l'tzad echad. He would put 2 rows to each other, right? So that they're not each going willy-nilly or all going towards the east or the west. They're going towards each other. V'zarei tanir. And then he would plant the fallow, the open field, again, not because of climate, but because there's no shade, right? And the shana acheret, the next year, he would switch it up, right? Crop rotation. He would turn the branches towards the place where he planted last year, Vizarat Abor, and then he would plant the space that he didn't plant the year before. And
So you're saying
Bama
he has 4 rows, for instance, and he turns the branches inward so they face each other, and then
no,
he has open space on the outside. Is that what you're
no,
saying?
no. So let's say there's row A, B, and C. Okay. So he's taking the branches from root A and B and pushing them towards the space between A and B, which is what we're going to call field number 1. So that field number 2, which is on the side of B, has no branches coming out on top of it. It's completely exposed, beautiful. You can plant anything you want there.
I
Okay,
thought, yeah, I thought that's what.
anything you want. So and the next year you take B basically and push it over to that field so that nothing is growing on field number 1. Again, it's hard to do this in numbers, but that's the case. So basically so the bottom line is that this, again, according to most, he did that because of shade, right? But the question was, are you allowed to plant your crops in between the rows of the vineyard? And they came in front of the Chachamim and they said, this is fine. Because since the vineyards are 16 amot apart from each other, the space between them is not considered to be part of it. And therefore you can plant whatever you want there, right? So now going back to our case, Abaye said to Rava, Abaye said, sorry, to not Rava, Abaye said to Rav Yosef, that's a Mishnah. The Mishnah clearly says that 16 amot is the shear, right? So I don't understand why you said it's 4 to 8. You put your upper limit at 8. The Mishnah clearly says 16. Amalei, so Rav Yosef said back to Abaya, that's very nice. It's a nice Mishnah. Ana lo yadan. I don't really know how to explain the Mishnah. Ela uvda havi, but there was a story, right? And this was a story bidura duravata. There was a story, and remember we had this before. This was a dura duravata, or shepherds, right? We said this was like an encampment that was set up by the shepherds, and right, there was some case where they basically had trees, and someone bought trees from somebody else. V'ata l'kamei de Rav Yehuda, right? They came in front of Rav Yehuda and they said to him, someone had bought a tree and he said to him, I get the space outside the tree. What is considered to be three trees together, right? All these questions. The Amarle and Rav Yehuda said to them, right? You have to gzil havle, you have to give him the trees, kimelo bakar v'chilav. It has to be enough space for a bakar, for a ox, and its kelim, right? The whatever accoutrements, whatever stuff that an ox uses to do its work. Now, the lo Adana, I didn't know how big that was, right? I didn't know kim lo bakar v'kilav kama. I didn't know how much that space was, right? And Ella, I'm not sure if I should keep reading, but I'm going to try it. Kivan the Shamad Lahadithan. Now, so then later I heard a Mishnah, and this was a Mishnah we had earlier in our Masechta, which said, Lo yita adam ilan samuch l'stei chavero. A person is not allowed to plant a tree next to his friend's field. Ella imkein hirchak mimeno arba amot, unless he puts the tree 4 amot away from the friend's field, right? You were referring to this before. B'tniyala, and we learned before about the Mishnah that arba amot sha'amru that when we say arba amot, because that's how much space it takes to work around the vineyard.
No,
and
I
so
said that. Yeah.
Therefore, correct. Amina, therefore, I thought to say, Shema mina kimalo bakar v'kilav arba amot. You see from here that and when we say malo bakar v'kilav, it means arba amot, right? Because it says you get a tree and the malo bakar v'kilav around it. It says elsewhere you get a tree and 4 amot around it. Those things must be the same shear. And so therefore, says Rav Yosef, I agree with you. I don't understand how the Mishnah in Kilayim makes sense, but this is clearly a case, and we love important cases, where the Rav Yehuda seemed to paskin halacha l'maisa that you get around 4 amot around the trees, and I say 4 to 8, not more than 8, 4 to 8, and therefore not 16, not the higher shear, but the lower shear. We're smack in the middle of a sugya, just to be very honest. But the bottom line is that there seems to be a machloket between these Amoraim about whether the space that defines 2 separate tree farms, right, is the maximum space. It's 8 amot, so 4 to 8, or 16 amot, 8 to 16. And tomorrow we're going to continue because we're going to realize that, obviously Mishnah seemed to support Rav Yosef. The story supported Rav Yehuda. The question is, which one do we go according to? And we will discuss that more, God willing, tomorrow. So complicated halacha, but it's all coming together now, right? We're getting all our references coming. But yeah, we're going to stop here on Pei Gimel Amud Aleph.
And there is a little, there is, when we're listening to you, it's not as clear as normal. Are you in a faraway place?
I'm in a faraway place, but God willing, I'll be back next week and it'll be as clear as normal.
Oh, you're far away then. You're the other part of the country.
The wires have to go really far. Okay. Shavua Tov. God willing, we'll meet again.
Thank you. Shavua Tov.
Sorry, James. I didn't see you were there, but we're going to maybe start a little later next week. So we'll put it in the chat, but we'll put all that information there.
Later on Sunday or later on?
Maybe both, but we're going to start with later on, let's say Shabbat, I think. And then I'm not sure yet about Sunday.
Okay. I'll stay tuned.
It'll all be in the chat. Okay. Have a great week, everyone.
Bye-bye.